At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. He was 27 years old, a state champion shooter back home in Illinois, but here in the war, he had 0 confirmed victories. The Japanese army had 11 expert snipers hiding in the thick groves of trees ahead. In just the last 3 days, those hidden shooters had hit 14 American soldiers. It was a dangerous time. John George's own boss, the commanding officer, had looked at John's rifle and called it a toy. The other leaders in his group made jokes, calling the gun his mail-order sweetheart. Back at the training camp in Tennessee, when John first unpacked his Winchester Model 70 rifle, the man in charge of weapons looked confused. He asked if John planned to hunt deer or fight in a war. John tried to explain that this rifle was perfect for stopping the enemy, but nobody listened. They all thought it was just a sporting gun for hunting animals in the woods, not for battling soldiers on an island. When the troops shipped out to the Pacific Ocean, they left before John's special rifle arrived. During the long boat ride to the island of Guadalcanal, John had to sit and watch the other soldiers clean their standard army rifles. Those guns were called Garands. They were tough, heavy, and made for war. John's gun was sitting in a dusty warehouse back in Illinois, but John didn't give up. He asked for his rifle to be sent through the military mail system. 6 weeks later, in late December, a supply sergeant walked up to John. He was holding a wooden crate with the word "fragile" stamped on the side. Inside was the rifle John had saved 2 whole years of his pay to buy. It was a beautiful machine. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The special glass scope on top added a little more weight. The standard Garand rifle that everyone else carried was heavier and didn't have a magnifying scope. That meant the other soldiers had to use their own eyes to see faraway targets. John had a huge advantage because his scope made things look bigger and closer, but there was a downside. John's rifle was a bolt action. That meant every time he fired a shot, he had to use his hand to pull a metal handle back and forth to load the next bullet. It was slow. The other soldiers had semi-automatic rifles which could shoot 8 times as fast as they could pull the trigger. Captain Morris, one of the officers, told John to leave his hunting gun in his tent and carry a real weapon. John listened politely, but he carried his Winchester anyway. The fighting on Guadalcanal was very hard. The Marines had been there since August, battling in the heat and rain. They had captured a big airfield, but they couldn't push the enemy off the tall hills or out of the thick forests near the river. The jungle was dangerous. The Japanese soldiers called the nearby mountain the Gifu. It was full of tunnels and bunkers. John's group fought there for 16 days. It was a brutal battle, and many Americans were hurt. During all that fighting, John never fired his special rifle even once. But the jungle near Point Cruz was different. Here there were no concrete bunkers or tunnels. Instead, the enemy soldiers hid inside the massive trees. These trees were like fortresses. The Japanese snipers used special rifles with scopes too. They knew the jungle better than anyone. They knew how to sit perfectly still and wait for a target. On January 19th, a sniper hit an American soldier who was just trying to fill his water bottle at a creek. The next day, another sniper stopped 2 more men. On January 21st, 3 more Americans were hit. One of them was hurt by a shooter hiding in a tree that the American patrol had walked past twice without seeing. That night, the battalion commander called for John. The commander was worried. The enemy snipers were hurting his men faster than the jungle sickness called malaria. He needed someone who could shoot back. He looked at John and asked if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. John told the commander the truth. He told him about winning the Illinois State Championship in 1939. He explained that he could hit a target the size of a dinner plate from hundreds of yards away. He told the commander that his scope was accurate and his hands were steady. The commander listened. He gave John one chance. He had until morning to prove that his toy could save lives. John spent the whole night getting ready. His rifle had been covered in thick grease to protect it from the salty ocean air during the trip. He cleaned every inch of it until the metal shone. He checked the screws holding his scope to make sure they were tight. He loaded 5 bullets. These were the same powerful bullets the Army used, but John had packed them carefully back in Tennessee. The sun came up on January 22nd. At dawn, John moved quietly into the broken remains of an old bunker. It sat on a hill overlooking the coconut trees. The intelligence reports said the enemy snipers were hiding in the banyan trees. These were monster trees. Some grew 90 feet tall, as high as a tall building, with trunks so thick you couldn't wrap your arms around them. A sniper could climb up there in the dark and sit all day, completely invisible. John didn't bring any helpers. He had no one to spot targets for him and no radio to call for help. It was just him, his canteen of water, his rifle, and 60 bullets. He settled into the dirt and began to watch the world through his scope. The scope made everything look 2.5 times bigger. It wasn't a huge amount of zoom, but it was enough to see things the naked eye would miss. The jungle was noisy. Birds screeched, insects buzzed, and far away cannons boomed. John blocked it all out. He didn't listen to the noise. He looked for movement. He moved his scope slowly, left to right, top to bottom. He scanned every branch and every shadow. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it. A single branch moved. There was no wind that morning, so the branch shouldn't have moved. It was high up, almost at the top of a banyan tree, 240 yards away. John froze and watched. The branch moved again. Then his eyes adjusted to the shadows. He saw a shape. It was a man in dark clothing, sitting in the V shape where 3 big branches came together. The enemy sniper was looking the other way, watching the trail where the American supply trucks drove. He didn't see John. John made tiny adjustments to his scope. He moved the dial 2 clicks to the right to account for the slight breeze. He took a deep breath and let half of it out to steady his chest. He touched the trigger. It was smooth and light. He had spent hours working on it back home to make it perfect. Now he would find out if a civilian champion could defeat a soldier trained for jungle war. John squeezed the trigger. Crack. The rifle kicked back into his shoulder. The sound echoed through the trees. 240 yards away, the shape in the tree jerked. The enemy sniper fell from his perch. His body tumbled down through the leaves and branches, falling 90 feet until it hit the ground near the roots of the giant tree. John didn't cheer. He quickly pulled the bolt handle back. The empty metal shell flew out and he pushed the handle forward to load a fresh bullet. He put his eye back to the scope immediately. He waited. Nothing moved. John knew that Japanese snipers usually worked in teams. One man did the shooting and another man acted as the spotter to find targets. If John had just stopped the shooter, the spotter was probably very close by, maybe in the same tree or maybe in the one next to it. John started scanning the trees again. Because his scope only zoomed in a little bit, he had to search very slowly. Every tree had hundreds of hiding spots. The sunlight coming through the leaves created dark shadows that could trick the eye. It was like a deadly game of hide and seek. At 9:43 a.m., 26 minutes later, he found the second man. This sniper was in a different tree about 60 yards to the north of the first one. He was lower down, maybe 50 feet in the air. The enemy soldier was climbing down the trunk, trying to escape. He had heard John's shot and knew that his hiding spot wasn't safe anymore. John followed the moving target with his scope. He aimed just a little bit underneath the climbing soldier, guessing where he would be in a split second. He fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree trunk. His rifle fell out of his hands and clattered through the branches. The man and his gun hit the jungle floor almost at the same time. 2 shots, 2 victories. John reloaded his Winchester again. His hands were rock steady. His breathing was calm. To him, this didn't feel like the chaos of war. It felt just like the target range back in Illinois. The toy rifle that everyone had laughed at was working perfectly. The snipers who had terrorized his friends were gone, and John George was just getting started. But this wasn't a target range in Illinois anymore. It was Camp Perry, except here the targets shot back. At 11:21 in the morning, the jungle exploded with a sharp crack. A Japanese bullet slammed into the sandbag right in front of John. It hit just 6 inches away from his head. The impact sprayed dirt and grit right into his face, stinging his skin. John didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He instantly rolled to his left and pressed his body flat against the wall of his bunker. His heart beat fast, but his mind was cool. He analyzed the shot immediately. The sound had come from the southwest. That was a different direction than the first 2 snipers. This was a new enemy. For 3 long minutes, John didn't move a muscle. He lay there in the dirt, listening to the sounds of the jungle. He knew the rules of being a sniper. Usually after a sniper takes a shot, they move to a new spot so they don't get caught. It's called shoot and relocate. But John knew this jungle. The trees and vines were so thick and tangled that moving quickly was almost impossible. The enemy sniper didn't have many places to go. Slowly, inch by inch, John moved back to his shooting position. He was careful not to let the sun reflect off his scope. He raised his binoculars and scanned the trees to the southwest. He looked for anything that didn't belong, a broken branch, a weird shadow, or a patch of color that didn't match the leaves. At 11:38, he found him. It was the 3rd tree from the left in a clump of banyan trees. The sniper was high up, about 73 feet above the ground. The enemy soldier had made a mistake. He had moved, but he stayed in the same tree. He had just climbed to a different branch. That was a fatal error. John lined up the crosshairs of his scope on the dark shape in the leaves. He took a breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked. The 3rd sniper fell from the tree without making a sound. By noon, the count had risen. John had taken down 5 Japanese snipers in a single morning. News traveled fast through the battalion. The other Marines were amazed. Just a few days ago, these men had made fun of his special rifle. They had called it a mail-order toy. Now those same men came up to him with respect in their eyes. They asked if they could sit with him and watch him work, like fans watching a baseball game. John shook his head. No, he told them. Spectators were dangerous. Extra people made noise. They moved around. They drew attention. And out here, attention drew fire. John worked alone. The Japanese soldiers were smart, though. After John killed the 5th sniper, they changed their strategy. They realized that moving during the day was a death sentence. So they stopped moving. For the rest of the afternoon, the jungle was still. John spent hours looking through his binoculars, checking every branch and every leaf, but he saw nothing. At 4:00 p.m., John returned to headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting for him. The captain wasn't laughing at the Winchester rifle anymore. He looked at John seriously and told him to be back in position at dawn. The next day, January 23rd, began with a storm. Heavy tropical rain poured down, turning the dirt floor of the jungle into thick, sticky mud. The rain was so hard that it was like a gray curtain. You couldn't see more than a football field's length away. John sat in his muddy bunker and waited. He kept his rifle dry and watched the sky. Finally, at 8:15 in the morning, the rain stopped. The sun began to burn through the mist. By 8:45, the air was clear enough to see. It didn't take long. At 9:12, John spotted the first target of the day. This Japanese soldier was clever. He had used the heavy rain to cover the sound of his climbing. While the storm was loud, he had scrambled up a tree without anyone hearing him. He had chosen a spot nearly 300 yards away. That was a very long shot. The enemy was testing John. They wanted to see if his fancy hunting rifle could hit them from that far away. John did the math in his head. He aimed slightly higher to make up for the distance. He fired. The sniper fell. That was kill number 6. But this time, something different happened. The Japanese army was tired of this lone hunter picking off their best men. They decided to use heavy weapons. At 9:57, a whistling sound cut through the air. Boom! Japanese mortar shells began exploding around John's area. A mortar is a small cannon that shoots explosive shells high into the air so they drop down on top of the enemy. The Japanese had figured out where John was hiding by watching the flash of his gun and listening to the sound. The first group of explosions landed 40 yards in front of him. Dirt and shrapnel flew everywhere. John knew what this meant. They were walking the fire toward him. They would adjust their aim and shoot again. The second group of shells landed just 20 yards away. The ground shook. The next ones would be a direct hit. John didn't think twice. He grabbed his Winchester and sprinted. He ran north, staying low along the line of trees. He saw a deep hole in the ground caused by an old explosion, a shell crater, and dove into it head first. Seconds later, the earth heaved. The bunker where he had been sitting just moments ago disappeared in a massive cloud of fire and flying wood. If he had stayed there 1 second longer, he would have been gone. John didn't stop. He crawled out of the crater and moved to a new spot. He found a massive fallen tree about 100 yards north of his destroyed bunker. The thick trunk offered perfect protection, and the tangled roots gave him a clear view of the jungle groves. He settled in, wiped the mud off his scope, and went back to work. The afternoon turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Japanese commanders sent more snipers into the trees. They knew John was out there hunting them, so they started hunting him back. The dynamic had changed. This wasn't just target practice anymore. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., John spotted a glint of movement. He fired. Sniper number 7 fell. An hour later, at 3:41 p.m., he saw number 8. This sniper had climbed very high, 94 feet up a giant tree. It was a good hiding spot because the leaves were thick. But as the sun went down, the angle of the light changed. The sniper's body created a dark shadow, a silhouette, against the bright sky. He stood out like a black cutout on a blue piece of paper. John took the shot. The 8th sniper fell. At 5 p.m., a runner from Captain Morris came to find John. He had been lying in the mud and roots for 9 hours. The captain wanted a report. John walked back to camp and gave the numbers. 12 shots fired, 8 confirmed kills, 4 misses. It was incredible shooting, better than almost anyone else in the war. Captain Morris nodded and ordered John to go back out at dawn on January 24th. That night the camp was quiet. John sat in his tent and cleaned his Winchester until it shone. He oiled the metal and polished the wood. As he worked, he thought about the math. Intelligence said 11 expert Japanese snipers were operating in this part of the jungle. John had killed 8 of them. That meant there were 3 left. These last 3 wouldn't be the rookies. They would be the best of the best. They were the ones who had survived the longest. They had watched John work for 2 days. They knew exactly what he looked like. They knew the sound of his gun. They knew his tricks. John loaded 5 fresh bullets into his rifle. He tried to sleep, but his mind was racing. At 3 in the morning, he gave up. He sat up in the dark with his rifle across his lap, waiting for the sun. The rain started again at 4:15 a.m. It poured down, delaying the sunrise. By 5:30 it was still too dark and rainy to see anything. John used the bad weather to his advantage. He knew the enemy expected him to be behind the fallen tree. He needed to be somewhere else. He grabbed his gear and moved quietly through the rain. He didn't go to the bunker, and he didn't go to the log. He chose a spot 70 yards south. It was a pile of large, jagged rocks that the Marines had used for a machine gun nest weeks ago. It was a perfect fortress. It had thick stone walls for cover and narrow cracks he could shoot through. He settled into the cold, wet rocks and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed down to a drizzle. The world came back into focus. John began scanning the trees with his binoculars. At 8:17 on the morning of January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree about 190 yards away. But something was strange. He was low, only 40 feet off the ground. That was very unusual. Most snipers liked to be high up so they could see farther. This soldier had wrapped himself in palm fronds, the big leafy branches of the tree. From the ground, he would have been invisible, but John wasn't on the ground. He was up high on the rocks. From his angle, he could look right down into the palm tree. He could clearly see the dark shape of the sniper's head and shoulders. John raised his rifle. He slowed his breathing. His finger touched the trigger. He was about to squeeze. Then he froze. Stop, his brain told him. Something is wrong. It was too easy. It was too obvious. John had been hunting these men for 3 days. He had killed 8 of their friends. The last 3 survivors were the experts. Experts don't make silly mistakes like sitting low in a palm tree where they can be easily seen, unless they wanted to be seen. It was a trap. The soldier in the palm tree was bait. John lowered his rifle slowly. He scanned the other trees nearby. If the man in the palm tree was the bait, there had to be a hunter nearby, waiting for the trap to spring. The real sniper would be watching the palm tree. He would be waiting for an American to take a shot. As soon as the American fired, the muzzle flash would reveal his position, and the real sniper would kill him. John began to search. He checked every single tree near the palm. He looked left to right, top to bottom. He moved his binoculars slowly, ignoring the easy target in the palm tree. It took him 11 stressful minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. Hidden in a massive banyan tree 80 yards away from the bait was the 10th sniper. He was 91 feet up in the air. This was a master at work. He had built a perfect hiding spot with branches and vines covering him from 3 sides. The master sniper had a clear view of John's old position at the fallen tree. He was waiting. He was watching the bait, finger on the trigger, ready to kill anyone who tried to shoot his friend. John had a problem. 2 problems, actually. First, the master sniper was looking in the wrong direction. He was watching the fallen tree. If John shot at him now, the sound would give away his new position in the rocks. The master sniper might survive the first shot, duck, and then spot John before John could reload. Second, if John did nothing, the master sniper would eventually realize John wasn't at the fallen tree. He would start searching the area and might spot John in the rocks. John made a daring decision. He was going to use their own trap against them. He swung his rifle back toward the bait, the soldier in the low palm tree. He aimed carefully. He adjusted for the wind. He fired. The decoy sniper jerked backwards and fell out of the palm tree. John didn't watch him fall. The instant he fired, he ripped the bolt of his rifle back, ejecting the empty shell, and slammed a new bullet into the chamber. He swung the barrel of his gun instantly toward the banyan tree. 91 feet up, He knew exactly what the master sniper would do. When the shot rang out, the master sniper reacted just like a human being. He was surprised. He heard the shot come from the rocks, not the fallen tree. He instinctively turned his body toward the sound. That turn was his mistake. It created movement. Through his scope, John saw the leaves shift. He saw the patch of uniform turn. The hidden master had revealed himself to face John. John was already waiting. George placed the crosshairs of his scope right over the dark shape in the tree. He didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger before the enemy sniper could fully turn around. Bang! The real sniper crumpled. He fell from the branches, and his rifle tumbled down after him, clattering against the trunk on the way down. 2 shots. 2 enemies down. It was a perfect moment, but George knew the danger was just beginning. The sound of his shots had echoed through the jungle. Now everyone knew exactly where he was. George didn't stick around to celebrate. He grabbed his heavy rifle and his boxes of ammunition and scrambled to his feet. He ran hard, moving east along the line of jagged rocks. His boots crunched on the gravel as he sprinted toward a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He dove into the ditch, pressing his body deep into the wet, sticky mud, and froze. He checked his watch. It was 8:34 a.m. Suddenly the air exploded with noise. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. Japanese machine guns tore into the rocks where George had been standing just 6 seconds ago. Bullets smashed into the stone, kicking up clouds of gray dust and sharp fragments. The attack was fierce and loud, lasting for 17 long seconds. George lay perfectly still in the ditch, his heart pounding against the mud. If he had stayed in those rocks for even a moment longer, he would have been gone. When the shooting finally stopped, silence returned to the jungle, but George knew better than to move right away. He counted to 60 in his head, 1 slow second at a time. Only when he was sure no one was watching did he move again. He stayed low, crawling on his belly toward a new hiding spot 100 yards further east. He found a large hole in the ground left by an exploding shell. It was a crater, partially filled with murky rainwater. George slid into the crater. The water was cold and dirty, rising all the way up to his chest. He didn't mind. The water hit him. He carefully rested his Winchester rifle on the muddy rim of the crater and looked through his scope again. He began scanning the trees, branch by branch. So far, George had confirmed 10 kills, but there was 1 sniper left. This 11th sniper would be different. He would be the best of them all. He was the smartest and the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his friends fall over the last 3 days. He knew how George fought. He knew the sound of George's rifle. He knew exactly which area George was hiding in. Somewhere in that thick green wall of trees, the last sniper was watching, waiting, and planning his revenge. George moved his scope slowly. The powerful lens made distant shapes look big and clear, but the jungle was tricky. Shadows played games with his eyes. Every dark spot could be a dangerous enemy, or it could just be a broken branch. George had to study each one, holding his breath to keep the rifle steady. At 9:47 a.m., George realized he had made a mistake. He had been looking up at the trees, but the 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. George caught a tiny flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. It was on the ground, 60 yards to the south. It was a dark shape moving through the tall grass and bushes. The enemy was crawling. The Japanese sniper was smart. He was using the ferns, vines, and fallen branches on the jungle floor to stay hidden. He was creeping slowly toward the rocks, the place where George had fired his last shot. George froze in the water-filled crater. He had his rifle on his shoulder, ready to fire, but he couldn't take the shot yet. The edge of his own crater was blocking his view. To see the enemy clearly, George would have to stand up, but if he stood up, he would be an easy target. So he waited. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52 a.m. He was now 40 yards away from the rocks. Through the scope, George watched the grass stop swaying. The enemy was studying the rocks, looking for any sign of George. Patience was the most important skill for a sniper. It wasn't about being the best shot. It was about being the best waiter. You had to be able to sit perfectly still, letting time tick by, waiting for the perfect moment instead of rushing a bad shot. At 9:58 a.m., the enemy started moving again. He crawled closer, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was coming from the south side. George nodded slightly. That was smart. The enemy knew George had run east after the machine gun attack. Now the enemy was hunting George exactly the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03 a.m., the Japanese sniper finally reached the rocks. He slid into the old machine gun nest and set up his position. He pointed his rifle east, aiming right at the drainage ditch where George had first hidden. The enemy was now only 38 yards away from George's crater, but he was facing the wrong way. He was looking at the ditch, leaving his back completely exposed to the crater. George had a clear shot. It was an easy target, even without a scope. He just had to pull the trigger, but George stopped. His finger hovered over the trigger. Something felt wrong. This enemy sniper had survived 10 days of fighting. He had outlived 10 other snipers. Men like that didn't make simple mistakes. The position in the rocks was too open. It was too easy to see. No expert sniper would sit there for more than a few seconds unless he had a plan. This had to be a trap. The man in the rocks was another decoy, bait to make George reveal himself. George kept his scope aimed at the man in the rocks, but he opened both eyes. He stopped looking at just the target and started looking at the whole jungle. If this was a trap, there had to be someone else. There had to be a second person waiting to shoot anyone who fired at the man in the rocks. At 10:06 a.m., George found him. 70 yards to the northwest, hidden behind a huge fallen tree trunk, was a second Japanese soldier. This soldier wasn't moving. He wasn't trying to get a better spot. He was just watching. His rifle was aimed perfectly at the drainage ditch. It was a team, 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought backup, or maybe these were the final 2 snipers, number 10 and number 11, working together to kill the American ghost. George had to make a tough choice. He couldn't shoot both men fast enough. His Winchester rifle was a bolt action. That meant after every single shot, he had to pull a handle back to eject the old shell and push it forward to load a new one. That split second took time. If he shot the man in the rocks, the man behind the tree would see him and fire before George could load his next bullet. He needed a different plan. Slowly, very slowly, George lowered his body deeper into the dirty water. He sank until only his eyes and the very top of his helmet were above the surface. He held his rifle straight up in the air, keeping the metal barrel out of the water so it wouldn't get clogged. Then he became a statue. At 10:13 a.m., the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes staring at the drainage ditch and had seen nothing. He decided George must have run even further away. He turned around and waved a hand signal to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men started moving east. They walked in a line about 70 yards apart from each other. They were doing a sweep, checking every bush and hole to flush George out. George stayed in the water. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. The 2 Japanese soldiers walked right past his crater. They looked left and right, but they didn't look down into the muddy pool. They passed him and kept walking toward the tree line. Now they were between George and the jungle. Their backs were turned. George rose from the water. He moved silently like a swamp monster rising from the depths. Water streamed off his uniform and dripped from his face, but he didn't wipe it away. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks. He was now 42 yards away. George fired. Bang! The soldier dropped instantly. George moved with lightning speed. He ripped the bolt back, the empty shell flying out, and slammed a new cartridge into the chamber. He swung the heavy rifle toward the second soldier. The second man, the one by the fallen tree, was already turning. He was raising his rifle to fire back, but George was faster. Bang! The second soldier fell. 11 shots were fired over 3 days. 11 enemy snipers stopped. George had single-handedly cleared the dangerous groves that had hurt so many Americans. The job was done. George let out a long breath. He climbed out of the muddy crater, his boots heavy with water. He reached down to pick up his empty bullet casings. He never left a trace behind. But just as his fingers touched the brass shells, a sound made him freeze solid. Voices. Japanese voices were coming from the tree line. They weren't whispering. There were multiple men, and they were moving fast toward the sound of the gunshots. George realized with a jolt of fear that the snipers hadn't been working alone. George scrambled back to the edge of the crater and slid in. The water was cold and murky, swirling with mud. He sank down, down, until the water covered his chin, his mouth, his nose. Only his eyes remained above the brown surface. He held the Winchester vertically again, keeping the tip of the barrel dry. The voices got louder. There were at least 6 men, maybe more. He could hear branches snapping and equipment rattling as they ran. These weren't stealthy snipers. This was a squad of infantry soldiers, a patrol sent to find out what happened to their friends. George counted the seconds in his head. The voices grew closer and closer until they stopped right at the first body, only 42 yards from his hiding spot. He could hear them talking clearly now. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were angry, and they were looking for him. Then the boots started moving again, coming closer, coming right toward the crater. The voices moved to the second body. The soldiers stopped, and the tone of their chatter changed. It became urgent. At 10:28 in the morning, the boots started thumping against the ground again. They were not heading back to the safety of the tree line. They were coming straight for George's hiding spot. They had found his tracks. George had been so careful about making noise. He moved like a ghost. But in the soft, wet mud, his heavy boots had left deep prints leading right from the rocks to the edge of the water. It was a trail that pointed right to him. George gripped his Winchester rifle. He had 5 bullets inside the gun. At least 6 Japanese soldiers were approaching, maybe more. Those were bad odds. His rifle was a bolt action. That meant every time he fired, he had to pull a lever back and push it forward to load the next bullet. It was slow. If the soldiers rushed him all at once with their fast-firing weapons, he would not survive. He thought about his choices. He could stay hidden under the muddy water and pray they walked past him, or he could fight. The voices grew louder, 30 yards away, then 25, then 20. At 10:31, a face appeared at the rim of the crater. A Japanese soldier looked down. He looked directly into the brown water. His eyes locked onto George's eyes. There was no time to think. George pulled the trigger while the gun was still half underwater. Bang! The soldier fell backwards, disappearing from the rim. George instantly worked the bolt. Click-clack, chambering a fresh round. He stood up from the water. 2 more soldiers rushed to the edge of the hole to see what had happened. George fired. 1 fell. He worked the bolt fast. He fired again. The second soldier dropped. 3 bullets left. Shouting erupted from the jungle. More soldiers were running toward the sound of the gunshots. George scrambled up the muddy wall on the north side of the crater, away from the yelling voices. He leapt out and sprinted 20 yards, diving behind a massive fallen tree trunk. Crack, crack, crack. Japanese bullets ripped through the jungle leaves. They struck the ground around the crater and chipped wood off the fallen tree. The soldiers couldn't see him yet. They were shooting at the noise and the movement. George stayed low, pressing his cheek into the dirt. He peeked through his scope. He saw movement between the trees. 2 soldiers were rushing toward the crater, about 50 yards away. George aimed at the one in front. He squeezed the trigger. The soldier crumpled to the ground. The second soldier immediately dove into the bushes for cover. 2 bullets left. George heard new voices behind him. The enemy was smart. They were flanking him. One group was coming from the south and another from the east. They were trying to draw a circle around him to trap him. He had to make a decision right now. He could not win a big gunfight with a slow rifle against a whole squad. He needed to break contact. He needed to get back to the American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the thick jungle. Vines grabbed at his boots, trying to trip him. Sharp branches whipped against his face. Behind him, the Japanese rifles cracked again. Bullets snapped past his ears like angry bees. They hit the trees next to him and kicked up dirt at his feet. He ran as hard as he could for 90 seconds. Lunging forward, he dove into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed his back against the dirt wall and held his breath, listening. The jungle went quiet. The voices were far away now. The enemy soldiers had stopped chasing him. They were likely regrouping back at the water crater to check on their fallen friends. George looked at his rifle. It was a mess. There was mud on the wooden stock, and water was still dripping from the metal barrel. He checked the ammunition. He had 2 bullets left in the gun. He reached for his pack to get more ammo, but his hand grabbed only air. The clips were in his pack, and his pack was back at the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George started moving again. He didn't run this time. He walked slowly, staying low, using the bushes and hills to hide. He headed northeast toward safety. The jungle was eerie and silent. There were no voices, no snapping twigs. The only sounds were his own heavy breathing and the deep rumble of big cannons firing far away. For nearly 30 minutes, he moved like a shadow. Finally, at 11:13, George saw the American perimeter. A Marine guard called out, challenging him. George shouted his name and rank. The guard lowered his weapon and waved him through. George walked straight to the battalion headquarters to find Captain Morris. The captain wanted to know everything that had happened. George gave his report. It was an incredible story. Over 4 days, he had hunted down 11 enemy snipers. He had fired 12 bullets at them and scored 11 hits. Then he had fought a whole squad of infantry soldiers to escape, taking down 3 more. Captain Morris asked, "How is your ammo?" "Down to 2 rounds, sir," George replied. "And the rifle?" "It works," George said, patting the muddy weapon. "But it needs cleaning. There is mud in the action and water in the barrel." Morris nodded. He told George to go rest. There would be no missions tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Japanese army was giving up on Guadalcanal and retreating. Intelligence said the enemy would be gone within 2 weeks. George walked back to his tent. He didn't sleep yet. First, he took apart his Winchester Model 70. He spent 2 hours cleaning every single piece. He used gun oil and cloth patches, scrubbing the barrel until the white cloth came out perfectly clean. He checked the scope to make sure it wasn't bent. Finally, he loaded 5 fresh, shiny bullets into the magazine. At 2:00 in the afternoon, a message arrived from headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George immediately. George walked to the main tent. He felt a little nervous. He wondered if Captain Morris was angry. Had George used too much ammo? Was he in trouble for fighting the infantry squad alone without backup? When he entered the tent, he saw Captain Morris standing with 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the boss of the entire regiment. Colonel Ferry didn't look angry. He looked impressed. He had just one question for George. Could you train other men to do what you did? George thought for a moment. I can try, sir, but it will take time. And the men need rifles with scopes, and they need to already know how to shoot. Colonel Ferry smiled. He said the division had found 14 Springfield rifles equipped with fancy inertial scopes. These were proper sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and Ferry had 40 men who were already expert shots. I want you to build a sniper team, the colonel said. Train them. Teach them your tactics. We need to clear out any Japanese snipers left in our area. George accepted the job, but he had one condition. I want to keep my Winchester, George said. Approved, the colonel said. So George kept his own hunting rifle, and the 14 Springfield rifles went to his students. Training started on January 27th. George gathered 40 men at a makeshift shooting range near the airfield. These men were great at shooting paper targets. They could hit a bullseye at 500 yards with regular iron sights, but none of them had ever been a sniper in combat. None of them knew how to hunt a man while staying invisible. George started with the basics: breathing control, how to squeeze the trigger gently, how to read the wind. The Springfield rifles were heavy. With the big scopes on top, they weighed 11 pounds. That was heavier than the standard Army rifles and much heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the guns steady, but it was tiring to hold them up for a long time. George taught them a trick. Use the jungle. He showed them how to rest the heavy guns on rocks, logs, or sandbags. A sniper couldn't wait for a comfortable spot. He had to build a stable shooting platform out of whatever he found in the dirt. For 3 days, they practiced. George made them shoot at still targets from 100 to 400 yards away. Then he made the targets move. Then he hid the targets behind leaves and branches so they were hard to see. By January 30th, the training was over. 32 of the 40 men passed the test. They could hit a man-sized target at 300 yards in the field. George split the men into 16 teams. Each team had 2 people, a shooter and a spotter. The shooter had the sniper rifle. The spotter carried binoculars and a regular rifle to protect them. The spotter's job was to find the enemy and watch the shooter's back. After a shot, they could switch roles. This way, they didn't rely on just one person. If one man got tired, the other was ready. On February 1st, it was time to test them in the real war. George took 4 of his new teams into the jungle. Their mission was to clear out Japanese positions west of the river. Intelligence said small groups of enemy soldiers were still there, stragglers who had missed the boat to evacuate. They moved out at dawn. George paired up with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They crept to the top of a high hill overlooking a dirt trail that the enemy used to move supplies. They waited. The sun began to rise. At 7:20 in the morning, a Japanese soldier walked onto the trail below. Corporal Hayes watched through his binoculars. "Target confirmed," he whispered. George settled behind his rifle. He took a slow breath. He fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt, ejecting the empty shell, and scanned the trees for more enemies. No one else appeared. The training was working. Over the next 6 hours, George and his team watched that trail. 7 more enemy soldiers tried to pass through. 7 shots rang out. 6 of those bullets found their mark. Only 1 was missed, pushed aside by a sudden gust of wind. It was incredible accuracy. Other sniper teams reported the same success. By the time the sun went down, 23 enemy soldiers had been stopped. The American side had 0 casualties. The sniper team kept working through the first week of February. They were like ghosts in the jungle. By February 9th, George's team had counted 74 confirmed hits, and George was being very careful with his counting. He only counted a hit if he actually saw the enemy fall. If he wasn't sure, he didn't count it. The real number was probably much higher. During this time, the Japanese army was trying to leave the island. They were beaten. Large ships called destroyers came in the middle of the night to pick up their soldiers from the western tip of the island. The Americans tried to stop them, but the Japanese left behind their bravest soldiers to fight back and protect the retreat. These were the soldiers George was hunting. On February 7th, George was moving near a river called the Tanamboa. He was looking for targets, but the jungle is a dangerous place where anyone can be hiding. Suddenly, a Japanese rifleman spotted him first. Crack. A bullet slammed into George's left shoulder. The force was so strong it spun him around like a top and knocked him into the dirt. His partner, Corporal Hayes, reacted instantly. He grabbed George by his uniform and dragged him behind a thick tree. Hayes yelled for a medic. George looked at his shoulder. It was a serious wound, but he was lucky. The bullet had gone through the muscle without hitting any big bones or major blood vessels. He wasn't going to die, but his fight on Guadalcanal was over. He was carried to a field hospital near the main airfield. The doctors cleaned the wound and stitched it up. They told him he would be fine, but he needed to rest. No fighting for at least 3 weeks. For 2 weeks, George lay in a hospital cot. While he healed, the war on the island ended. The Japanese finished their evacuation and slipped away into the ocean. On February 9th, American troops reached the end of the island and found it empty. The campaign was officially over. George's sniper section had only worked for 12 days, but they had changed the battlefield. 74 confirmed hits, and not a single American sniper lost. The Army commanders were impressed. A colonel named Ferry even recommended George for a medal called the Bronze Star. But George wasn't ready to go home. He was a soldier, and there was still a war to fight. While he was recovering, a secret order came down from the high command. The Army needed experienced officers for a new, dangerous mission. It was happening in a place called Burma, and it was classified, which meant it was a secret. George didn't ask questions. He volunteered. By March, George was on a giant transport ship heading west across the Pacific Ocean. His trusty Winchester Model 70 rifle was packed away in a waterproof case deep in the ship's cargo hold. His scope was wrapped in oilcloth to keep it safe. George didn't know exactly what he would be doing in Burma. He only knew it involved deep jungle warfare and long patrols behind enemy lines. It sounded like exactly the kind of place where a man who could hit a target from 600 yards away would be useful. The ship arrived in India on April 3rd. George joined 200 other officers in a large briefing room. They were told they would be leading a new unit of 3,000 men. This group didn't even have a real name yet. The soldiers came up with their own nickname. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The men trained hard in the heat of central India. They were learning how to survive in the jungle with no help. They would have no supply trucks and no bases. They had to carry everything on their backs. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. On the official list, his job was Rifle Platoon Leader because the Army didn't really have an official job title for sniper. But his commanders knew who he was. Colonel Ferry's report had followed him all the way from Guadalcanal. The bosses knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. George knew that Burma would be harder than the island. The mountains were steeper, the rain was heavier, and the enemy knew the land better than the Americans did. He decided his gear needed to change. He went to work on his Winchester rifle. It had been perfect for the island where he could go back to base for food and rest. But in Burma, they would be walking for weeks. Every single ounce of weight mattered. If his pack was too heavy, he would move too slowly. George took off the heavy scope he used on the island. He replaced it with a much lighter one called a Weaver 330. It didn't zoom in quite as much, but it was half a pound lighter. Then he did something drastic. He took off the beautiful wooden stock of the rifle, the part you hold against your shoulder, and replaced it with a stock made of cheap, light plastic. It didn't look as nice, but it worked. He managed to shave almost a full pound off the weight of the gun. It might not sound like much, but when you have to carry 60 pounds of food and ammo on your back for hundreds of miles, a lighter gun feels like a blessing. In February of 1944, the marauders entered the jungles of Burma. Their mission was huge. They had to walk through the entire northern part of the country to capture a critical airfield called Myitkyina. The Japanese army had 4,000 troops guarding the area. They thought they were safe because the jungle was impassable. They didn't think any large army could walk through those mountains and rivers. But the marauders were going to try. They had no jeeps or tanks. They only had mules, strong animals similar to horses, to carry the heavy mortars and ammo. Everything else was on the soldiers' backs. The march began on February 24th. It was a nightmare. In just the first week, they hiked 83 miles through mountains covered in thick vines. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Mosquitoes bit them, spreading a sickness called malaria. The poor mules slipped on the steep, muddy trails, and some broke their legs and had to be left behind. By March, they had walked over 200 miles. They bumped into Japanese forces 12 times. These weren't big battles. They were quick, scary fights called skirmishes. The Americans would shoot, create chaos, and then disappear back into the trees before the Japanese could catch them. George carried his modified Winchester every step of the way. He didn't use it often. In fact, during the whole march, he only fired it 3 times. But each time he made it count. The first time he saw a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. The officer was 412 yards away, more than 4 football fields. George steadied his breathing. Bang! The officer fell. The second time, a Japanese machine gun was pinning down his friends. It was 380 yards away. George found a gap in the leaves. Bang! The machine gun went silent. The third time was a duel. A Japanese sniper was hiding in the trees, trapping an American patrol. George spotted him at 290 yards. Bang! The American patrol was safe. 3 shots, 3 hits. George had a strict rule: never shoot twice from the same spot. His Winchester bolt-action rifle made a very loud, distinctive sound. It was different from the crack ping of the semi-automatic rifles the other soldiers used. The first shot announced that a sniper was there. If he fired a second shot, the enemy would figure out where he was hiding and blow him up. So George learned to shoot once and move immediately. The march to the airfield took 3 agonizing months. By late May, the marauders had walked over 700 miles through the worst terrain on Earth. The unit was falling apart. They started with over 5,000 men, but now they had fewer than 3,000 left. Most of them hadn't been shot. They were just too sick or too tired to walk. But they didn't give up. On May 17th, the ghostly, exhausted soldiers of Merrill's marauders burst out of the jungle and captured the Myitkyina airfield. The mission was a success. They had done the impossible. But the cost was high. The unit was combat ineffective, which is a military way of saying they were too broken to keep fighting. They needed rest, food, and doctors. George survived the Burma campaign. His modified Winchester survived too. But he realized something interesting. On the island, the rifle was the star of the show, but in the deep jungle of Burma, he had only used it 7 times in 3 months. The fighting there was different. It was messy and close up. Usually the enemy was only 50 yards away, hidden in bushes so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. In that kind of fight, a long-range sniper rifle wasn't very useful. George looked at his bolt-action rifle. It was a masterpiece of engineering, maybe the best sporting rifle ever made. But warfare was changing. The new semi-automatic rifles could shoot fast, putting lots of bullets in the air to keep the enemy's head down. The days of the slow, precise bolt-action rifle in standard combat were fading away. The next war would need different weapons and different tactics, but for George, there would be no next war for a while. He had walked through hell and come out the other side. Now it was finally time to rest. George was finally evacuated from the damp, dangerous forests of Burma, along with the rest of the weary soldiers known as the Marauders. The famous fighting unit was broken up, their difficult mission finally complete. But for George, the army wasn't finished with him just yet. He was sent back home to the United States in the summer of 1944 to take on a new mission. He was now a captain, and he was stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia. His fighting days were over, but his teaching days had just begun. George stood before groups of young officers who were preparing to go overseas. His job was to teach them how to shoot straight and how to lead small teams into battle. He passed on every hard lesson he had learned in the mud of Guadalcanal and the thick vines of Burma. He taught them how to move silently through jungle terrain without snapping a twig. He taught them how to spot an enemy hiding in the distance and how to survive alone when no supply trucks were coming to help. And what about the rifle, the famous Winchester Model 70 that had saved his life so many times? It had traveled a long, long way. It had gone from a shop in Illinois to a competition in Tennessee, then across the ocean to the tropical islands, to India, to Burma, and finally down to Georgia. It had done its terrible work, stopping at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed battles, and likely many more than that. But George had stopped counting back in the jungle. Now the rifle sat quietly in a wooden footlocker in his room at the military base. George hardly ever looked at it. The world outside was changing very fast. The war in the Pacific was ending as American forces took back the islands one by one. In Europe, troops were marching toward Germany. The army decided they didn't really need special marksmen with their own fancy hunting rifles anymore. They wanted big factories making thousands of rifles that were all exactly the same for soldiers with identical training. George understood why this was happening. Modern war was huge. It required giant industries and mass production. But he felt a little sad about it. He felt that something special was being lost, the skill of the individual craftsman. The idea that one man with the right training and the perfect tool could change the outcome of a whole battle was fading away. By January of 1947, George took off his uniform for the last time. He left the army as a lieutenant colonel with medals on his chest, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a combat infantry badge. He went back to Illinois, but he didn't stay still. He went to college at Princeton University. The man who had hunted snipers in the mud was now a scholar reading books in a library. He studied politics and graduated with top honors. After that, he kept learning. He spent 4 years at the famous Oxford University, and then another 4 years traveling through East Africa to study how governments worked there. He eventually settled down in Washington, D.C. He became an important man in the State Department, advising the government on African affairs. During all those years wearing suits and giving speeches, George rarely spoke about Guadalcanal or Burma. His friends at work knew he had served in the Pacific, but they didn't know the scary details. They didn't know about the battle at Point Cruz. They didn't know about the Japanese snipers he had outsmarted. And they certainly didn't know about the Winchester Model 70 that was sleeping in a case in his house. But in 1947, George decided he needed to write it all down. He didn't do it to get famous. He just wanted a record for himself. He wanted to describe the weapons and the tactics of jungle warfare before he forgot the details. He typed for 6 months. The stack of paper grew to over 400 pages. A friend from the National Rifle Association read what George had written and told him it needed to be a book. George wasn't sure. He thought it was too boring for normal people to read because it was full of technical details about bullets and ballistics, but he was convinced to do it. The book was published with the title, Shots Fired in Anger. It became a legend. People who loved history and firearms thought it was a masterpiece. It didn't brag or tell tall tales. It just described exactly what worked in combat and what didn't. Even today, historians read his book to understand World War II. It remains one of the best descriptions of that time ever written. George lived a long life. He watched the United States fight 3 more wars in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. He watched military rifles change from heavy wood to lightweight plastic and metal. And he saw something else happen. The Army realized that George had been right all along. They started training snipers again. They created special schools for marksmen. The lessons George had learned in the 1940s were being learned again by new generations of soldiers. John George passed away on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. His partner, that trusty Winchester rifle, did not disappear. It was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today, it sits inside a glass display case with a small card explaining its history. Most visitors walk right past it without stopping. To them, it looks like any old hunting rifle used for deer. But it is not just a hunting rifle. It is a piece of history. It is the rifle that proved a state champion sport shooter could beat professionally trained military snipers. It is the rifle that cleared out a dangerous enemy position in 4 days when a whole battalion of soldiers couldn't do it in 2 weeks. It is the rifle that changed how the American military thought about the value of a single skilled marksman. Stories like this one are important. They rescue forgotten heroes from the dusty shelves of history. They remind the world that real people with skill and courage can make a difference. Whether someone is learning about this story in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, they become part of keeping the memory alive. John George and his rifle deserve to be remembered, and sharing his legend ensures he never disappears into silence.